In chapter 13, we continue to build on the verb system, in this case the imperfect tense. And the imperfect tense is a part of the first principal part, so it shares durative action with the present tense. Before we discuss the imperfect tense, we will go back here in the book to the language lesson number 3 to discuss verb morphology. And what I like here that Stevens does is he presents verb morphology in 6 easy boxes. And from now on, whenever we discuss new verbs, I want you to go back to these 6 boxes. Box number 1 represents the augment or action time, and for the imperfect tense we will see that we use the augment. Box number 2, we will wait with that for a while, but that represents reduplication or action kind. Box number 3 we've seen already, because that represents the tense stem, and we find that of course in every principal part, action kind. Then box number 4, that will be a while as well. We will see this first in the future tense, but that's the tense suffix that also indicates action kind. That could be anything, like an extra consonant in there. And then box number 5 we've seen as well, because that's your thematic vowel, the connector part. And box number 6, another familiar one, that's the box that indicates inflection or the action performer, your person and number to be precise. So we have seen primary endings, and now we will see secondary endings. And so let's see here, when we talked about the present active indicative, we invoked boxes 3, 5, and 6 because we had a tense stem from lu, luo. We used a thematic vowel like an epsilon or an omicron, and we used primary endings. So in this case, this would be a second person plural from luo, luete. So when we go now into our new chapter, we will see that the imperfect tense morphology looks somewhat similar, with the exception that we now also have box number 1 occupied, our augment, because that's a past time indicator. And we will see that the inflection uses secondary endings. So let's start at the beginning and remind ourselves that English is grammar of time, but we're much more interested in action kind. We're still in the indicative mode, so we still have some degree of action time, but we are definitely interested in action kind, which is durative here. So we have the durative stem still, because we are in the first principal part. Notice the key here, the Greek imperfect tense is the second of the 2 tenses of the first principal part. So they share that same little category, if you will. The durative action stem is easily derived from any verb in the dictionary by dropping the final omega of the first person singular primary ending. Okay, so we have the time augment here. It's a prefix, and whenever you see that, you know you're dealing with past tense. So let's see how that works. You'll have to learn to recognize it. Whenever a verb starts with a consonant, you will recognize this because it often starts by using an epsilon. There's one exception, that is if the initial consonant is a rho, it will actually double itself. So the R is pretty obnoxious, it wants to double. If the verb starts with a vowel, then we have some trouble, because now you want to add an epsilon to an already existing vowel. So it's kind of like with contraction verbs. We're going to see some fireworks. If the short vowels alpha and epsilon are the culprits, then when they meet the extra epsilon being the augment, it will lengthen to an eta. If it is a short vowel omicron, it will lengthen to an omega. If initial rough breathing is in place, then it will be retained. Sometimes, by way of exception, the epsilon will actually lengthen to a diphthong, like in the case of echo, I have. In other cases, when you have short vowels like iota or upsilon, it actually just kind of stays in place. It does not change. The sound kind of left some changes, but you would only hear that if you were speaking the language. You don't visibly see a change. Vowels already long, so eta and omega stay the same because it would absorb the short epsilon into it, right? Diphthong reactions simply have to be observed and noted per verb, so you learn that. But typically, if you have alpha iota or omicron iota, it will still respond as if they are just the short vowels, and the iota will become a subscript. And then you have some less commonly known and appearing ones, and they just have to be observed. So you see some examples here. See how the alpha becomes the lengthened eta, the epsilon becomes the lengthened eta as well. Then you have that exception from echo. Notice that the epsilon becomes a diphthong, the omicron lengthens to an omega. And so this is just the following of rules. Here you have these particular diphthongs. Notice it kind of follows the basic rule of short vowel to long vowel, and the iotas become subscripts. Now remember, if you have compounds, then the compounded preposition always precedes all morphological boxes. So it comes all the way at the beginning. So that means it also precedes your augment box number 1, which places in the end the augment in the middle like a sandwich. Sometimes that introduces some funkiness, like here where you see the kappa changing its consonant shape. Or even its vowel shape, where you have ana as a preposition, epsilon may come out stronger and you see a slight change. So in other words, your compound may be hiding then the augment, and you'll have to start developing an eye for that. Now you're not alone, remember, in all this, because the ending will be different. You will also observe secondary endings, and once you see that, you'll be clued in to look at the beginning and start recognizing, hey, you know, I'm not quite seeing something right off the bat, but maybe those are prepositions, and maybe I need to look in the middle to see if some augment is hidden in there and got sandwiched. We have a thematic vowel here that's still being used in the first principal part. Just like with the present, you're going to encounter contract verbs, and they're still recognizable by its circumflex, very typical. We have inflection, but in this case we have secondary endings. So secondary tenses, we call them, take secondary endings, and so it's just a matter of memorization. Once again, we have active forms and middle passive forms. Just memorize them. Notice that the third person singular often is just left blank, and you'll just have to learn it by observation what that looks like. Okay, in the active voice, then you know, sometimes the resultant look is just a thematic vowel, and notice that the first and second plural endings, main and te, they look pretty much like the primary endings, and you're like, how am I going to recognize the difference? Well, remember, it's a past tense, so we're going to have the past tense indicator, which is your augment. And so look here, you could have luomein, or you could have eluomein, and of course the second one is the imperfect because it has the augment. And so somewhat important also is to recognize that the third plural usually is the nu, but sometimes the son, and you just have to learn it by observation. The first singular main sometimes can be confused with the active first plural main, so be careful to notice that it has the long eta. Okay, so memorize it with that long sound in mind. So we have a whole series here now, so be able to just kind of fill this out, practice that. And then it's just the same as we did for the present. Just practice locating that. Its translation would be I was losing, you were losing, to kind of give it a durative sense. I was being loosed, to give that sense of agency. If you want to make it a middle, I was loosed for myself, you can do that. Notice that we have contract verbs here as well. Notice the circumflex here in the present, and we can make it the imperfects. And there you go, same deal, but now secondary endings. The imperfect also has an AMI. Of course, it has same following there, still no mood, but no voice, I mean. So just memorize that. As we talked about in class, for translation purposes, you need to keep in mind that it can have some nuances. So it has the durative sense, but durative can be varied. We can emphasize the beginning of a durative action, so an action that started in the past. Like here, a didasken, and he began to teach them. The emphasis is on its inception, the beginning of the action. A conative will have the emphasis being on an impulse or a certain expression. He was trying, attempting to destroy it, that is the church. Or a customary imperfect, emphasizing a habit or a custom. And so that is a typical decision that you have to make as a translator. And then imperfect also, of course, has the deponent. So keep an eye on that. Erkanta comes from erkamai. So remember that you have to translate that actively rather than passively.